What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my Dark Practitioner build for Divinity Original Sin 2. So before we get started, I just want to say if you enjoy the video, I hope you'll consider hitting the join button down below. Becoming a member for about $1, you get some cool perks. I get $1, it helps grow the channel. Consider it. Thanks even if you don't. Now, on to the build. So, the Dark Practitioner is all about summoning and necromancy. So, obviously, that has us picking things up from the Summoning and Necromancer trees. We're not going to put a lot of points into Necromancer, but we'll get into that in a bit. So in terms of race or origin, it doesn't really matter. A lot of that stuff doesn't affect builds in a particularly substantial way in this game. So whatever race, class combo you want to do, race combo that is, do your thing. It doesn't really matter. So for stats, we are going to use Intelligence and Constitution. The rest are unnecessary. So every level you get 2 points, put 1 in each, and you're pretty much good to go. So for our combat abilities, like I mentioned, Summoning we are going to max out all the way to 10. That is very important. Necromancer, we are only going to go to 3. It doesn't matter how you get to 3, just get it to 3. All of the skills we're using in Necromancer only require 3, so that's pretty much all you need. And then with the points that we have left, we're actually going to dump the rest into Leadership. That is because, as an intelligence build, we are using a wand or a staff, but a wand is usually the best because we can use a shield with a wand, and shields give you a ton of extra stats, but again, I'll get into that in a second. So, the reason we're not putting any points into weapons, period, is because we are using a wand. So, wands technically fall under single-handed when you're using them with a shield. However, they do elemental damage, so what they actually get extra damage off of is the appropriate elemental skill tree. The problem with that is that Necromancy and Summoning are not actually skills that affect elemental damage. So, because of that, the damage from our weapon is actually going to be pretty useless, and you're basically just going to want to try to find one that gives you stats that are decent because you're not actually going to be hitting anybody with this. However, the shield is important because we get tons of stats from shields because they only require Constitution to use, which we will have. And they can give you tons of stats for basically anything you want to do. So find one that's good, use it, gives you a ton of armor and blocking chance, which is always nice. From there, we actually want to dump the rest into Leadership, like I said. So Leadership actually grants your entire party 20% chance to dodge and 30% extra resistances at max Leadership. So that's amazing. Specifically, the 20% dodge is huge. That is all we're going to have for combat abilities. Civil abilities, do whatever you want, doesn't make a difference. Talents, we are going to be picking up All Skilled Up, which gives us extra combat and civil ability points. I like to pick up Comeback Kid, which means once per combat, if we die, we're instantly resurrected with 20% health. Far Out Man increases the range of our skills and scrolls by 2 meters. Pet Pal, of course, lets us talk to animals. It doesn't necessarily need to be you. I usually put this on the character I'm actually playing with, so in this particular playthrough, that was this guy. But someone in your party needs to have Pet Pal. I usually just put it on the person I'm actually using. Sophisticated and Spell Song we get simply for being a lizard. And then, of course, Spider's Kiss is from a quest in Act 2. It is not actually a talent you normally get. So this guy's level 19, which means we actually get one more talent at level 20. So for that one, I usually recommend either Morning Person or Mnemonic. So Morning Person, when you get resurrected, you immediately get all of your health rather than I think it's like 30% normally. And then Mnemonic will give you extra skill slots if you need those. So usually either of those are a pretty good option. And that brings us to our skills. So with skills, our main thing is we're going to be summoning, which is obviously going to focus primarily around the summoning focal point, which is the Conjure Incarnate. And then we're going to be giving that Incarnate Power Infusion. We're going to do that pretty much as the opening move of every combat is going to be Conjure Incarnate and giving it Power Infusion. So at level 10, that gives our Incarnate champion status, which gives us this giant Incarnate, and that Power Infusion gives him a Whirlwind attack and a Battering Ram, which helps knock enemies down and keep them down. And then, of course, it also grants extra abilities depending on where you summon it. So if I were to summon it in this blood pool, it gets extra necromancy points, things like that. But coming back to us, so necromancy is mostly going to be for a couple of summons and then some spells we're going to use for offense. Because like I said, we're not really using our wand to attack anything ever. So Mosquito Swarm and Infect are the abilities from the Necromancy tree that we're primarily using to damage people with. They do have a 3-round cooldown, which means we won't be able to use them all the time. Mosquito Swarm lets us hit targets at range, and then regardless of whether or not we actually break through physical armor with this, it does actually give us our health back, so as you can kind of see the range there. So that's kind of a standard Necromancy attack. It just gives you some health back. It's a nice little move. Infect does even more damage. It also puts a disease on enemies that reduces damage done as well as lowers their health. So that's always super useful. Again, 3-round cooldown, can't use it all the time. 15-meter range, so pretty much the same as Mosquito Swarm, but does extra damage and causes disease. That brings us to Dimensional Bolt. So Dimensional Bolt is the spammable from the summoning tree. It does a random type of damage and creates a corresponding surface. We're not going to be using this all the time, but basically it just gives us something to use if we don't have anything else to use, as opposed to having to use our wand to attack something, which, like I mentioned, is pretty well useless. For our next one, we're going to have Dominate Mind. So Dominate Mind is a summoning ability that lets you charm characters for 2 turns, enemies specifically, obviously, and that will make them fight for you for 2 turns. Now, you can actually also get this in grenade form, but this is the skill version of that ability, and it is awesome. I recommend using it. It does have a very long cooldown, though. And it is, of course, resisted by magic armor, so make sure to cut through magic armor before you actually use this. Bloated Corpse and Bone Widow are 2 alternative summons we're going to be able to use. So Bone Widow is a personal favorite of mine because I think it looks awesome. Summons this bone spider, and it can burrow around the battlefield as well as consume corpses for extra vitality. Now, the cool thing about Bone Widow and Bloated Corpse, and the reason we're actually using them at all, because, as I mentioned, Conjure Incarnate is the primary summon we're going to be using, and we can only have 1 summon active at a time. So if I summon Incarnate, it's going to desummon this. So why are we using it? Well, there's going to be moments where your Incarnate dies and you need a backup summon, in which case I recommend using Bone Widow. Bloated Corpse is also a summon. So Bloated Corpse, there has to be a corpse there. But the reason we're using it is because it has a really cool AoE attack where you can blow it up and it does a bunch of damage to the enemies around it. So if you have a bunch of tightly grouped up enemies and you can get a Bloated Corpse over there, getting it to blow up will do a crap ton of damage to a lot of enemies in a small space, which I think is awesome, and it does have its uses, and also it creates a ton of blood everywhere, which can be useful for other things. Shackles of Pain is cool. You mark a target that doesn't have physical armor, and any damage you take will also hit them, bypassing all resistances, which is awesome, and as a caster, discourages enemies from hitting us, frankly. Now, that brings us to Elemental Totem. So we target a ground surface, and it conjures a totem of that type. So if we cast it on fire, we get a fire totem. If we do it on blood, we get a totem that does extra physical damage. If we cast it on just regular old ground, it'll create a wood totem, which just does like basic physical damage as opposed to the extra physical damage of the blood totem. Now, these last for 3 turns, so they don't last a lot, but they do extra damage every single turn, which is very nice. And all these other skills are things we've just gotten from items and aren't super important. So the actual play style of this is to pretty much, your opening turn should pretty much always be Conjure Incarnate, hit it with a power infusion, and then that'll take 3 of your 4 action points, and you can usually end the turn there. And the next turn you can start plopping down elemental totems and hitting things with stuff like Infect and Mosquito Swarm and the like. So that's pretty much the basic play style unless something specific is happening. So this build is really good at helping you control the battlefield through status effects and just overwhelming people with summons. That's kind of our main focus of this. And then the last thing I want to mention is for our big source ability. Usually I like to pick just 1 source ability for each character, but like technically you can use more if you wanted to, but most of them require more than 1 skill slot, so I usually only like to pick up 1 of them. I recommend either Grasp of the Starved or Ethereal Storm. Ethereal Storm is unpredictable, but it can heal your allies as well as do damage to enemies of a random type. It's fun, but it's not always super effective in terms of damage. Now, Grasp of the Starved will basically anybody standing in a blood surface in the target location will get hit by hands and get set to crippled if they don't have any physical armor. So it's really cool. I like it because it does a lot of damage. as well as sets the crippled status, which again helps us control enemies by locking them down in one location. Usually I pick one of those for this. There are others for necromancy and summoning, but like most of them suck, if I'm being honest. Necromancy has a couple others that are okay, but personally I just prefer Grasp of the Starved. Most of the summoning ones are terrible, to be honest. Like Ethereal Storm's like one of the only ones that even does damage for the source abilities. As with all of my builds, I do playtest these on Tactician mode with a party setup that I have on my channel as well called the Unbowed. So I always do this as the avatar, and then these other 3 characters are always pretty much the exact same build. So I kind of playtest things that way, so I do know it works on Tactician mode to some degree. To some degree, and I say to some degree because, you know, obviously I don't know what your party composition is like, so this might be terrible with a certain group that you're trying to put together. But with the Unbowed video on my channel, if you use that party setup, this should work for you. It did well for me. I enjoyed playtesting it. It was pretty fun. Obviously, it is very summon focused. Like, that was kind of the theme, was like, how can I put down summons and control the battlefield through basically forces. Now, one last thing I want to mention before I wrap this up is that if you're unaware, elemental totems do not count as summon. I can have as many elemental totems up with my summon as I please. So you can just keep casting elemental totem as many times as you can get it out. And with a 1-round cooldown, you can put up 1 every single turn. So that's cool. So basically, like I said, the theme with the Dark Practitioner was really just to try to swarm the battlefield as much as possible with one person. And I think it turned out pretty well. And the last thing I'm going to mention before we wrap this up is that for gear, you're just going to want to go for gear that requires intelligence and is level appropriate. Because of the way gear rolls in Divinity, there's not really like specific items I could tell you to get. There are uniques, but they don't scale to your level, so it's not like super useful for me to tell you like where a specific unique is in an act, because it's not always going to be useful for you because of the itemization and just your level sometimes. There you go, guys. That is the Dark Practitioner build. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun to make and play around with. Questions, comments, all that stuff in the comment section below. Again, I hope you'll consider joining the channel as a member. But either way, thank you so much for watching. Hope you subscribe and stick around, but see you later.